What if I told you that for more than a century, the United States became one of the fastest growing nations on earth without a permanent federal income tax? No paycheck deductions, no annual tax season, no powerful tax agency tracking every dollar you earn. Yet somehow, the government still built roads, expanded its borders, paid off massive debts, maintained an army and navy, and transformed a fragile republic into a continental power. That raises a question most of us have never stopped to ask. If Americans weren't paying income taxes, where did Washington get the money? And more importantly, why did everything change in 1913? Why did a system that had survived for 124 years suddenly disappear, replaced by one that still shapes every paycheck today? The answer isn't as simple as Congress passed a new law. It's a story of bankrupt governments, constitutional safeguards, frontier rebellions, financial crises, industrial empires, and a century-long struggle over one fundamental question: how much power should a government have over the wealth of its own citizens? To understand why your paycheck looks the way it does today, we have to travel back to a nation that had just won its freedom, but stood on the edge of financial collapse. Because before America learned how to tax income, it first had to figure out how to survive. When the Revolutionary War finally came to an end, in 1783, Americans had every reason to celebrate. They had defeated the most powerful empire in the world and secured their independence against incredible odds. But behind the celebrations, parades, and speeches was a far less inspiring reality. The new nation was nearly bankrupt. Victory had come with an enormous price tag. Years of war had drained every available resource. The Continental Congress had borrowed heavily, printed unstable currency, and promised payments it had little chance of making. By the time the fighting stopped, the federal government had accumulated roughly $54 million in debt, while the individual states owed another $25 million of their own. For a young country with a tiny economy, those numbers were staggering. Yet the debt itself wasn't the greatest danger. The real crisis was that the national government had almost no practical way to pay it back. Under the Articles of Confederation, the country's first governing framework, Congress could request money from the states, but it couldn't force them to contribute. Every request depended on voluntary cooperation. Some states paid a little, others paid nothing at all. Many simply ignored Congress completely. Imagine trying to run an entire country while depending on 50 separate governments to decide whether they felt like funding you. That was America's reality. The federal government couldn't reliably pay soldiers. It struggled to honor foreign loans. Creditors across Europe began questioning whether the new republic would survive long enough to repay its debts. In many ways, the United States looked less like an emerging superpower and more like a failing startup running out of cash before it had even opened its doors. The country's leaders understood the danger immediately. A government without reliable revenue wasn't merely inefficient, it was vulnerable. If it couldn't pay its debts, defend its borders, or enforce its own laws, independence itself might not last very long. That growing sense of urgency became one of the driving forces behind the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. The delegates weren't simply rewriting a political document. They were trying to answer a far more practical question. How do you build a government strong enough to survive without making it powerful enough to become another tyranny? Finding that balance would shape every financial decision America made for more than a century, and the solution they eventually created was unlike anything most people imagine today. Because the Founding Fathers gave Congress the power to collect taxes, while quietly making one particular kind of tax almost impossible to use. The delegates who gathered in Philadelphia didn't deny that a government needed money. They had just lived through the consequences of a government that couldn't fund itself. They knew firsthand that independence meant very little if the nation couldn't pay its soldiers, honor its debts, or defend its borders. So when they drafted the Constitution, they made one thing absolutely clear. Congress would have the authority to raise revenue. For the first time, the federal government was given the constitutional power to collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. It was a dramatic shift from the weak Articles of Confederation, and one of the biggest changes in the new system of government. But there was a catch, a very deliberate one. The men writing the Constitution had fought an entire revolution against a government they believed abused its taxing power. To them, taxation wasn't just about money, it was about control. The phrase taxation without representation wasn't simply a slogan. It was one of the main reasons they had gone to war in the first place. They had no intention of replacing one distant government with another that could reach into every citizen's pocket whenever it wanted. So they designed a constitutional safeguard that would quietly shape American fiscal policy for generations. Article 1. Section 9 declared that any direct tax had to be apportioned among the states according to population. At first glance, it sounds like dry legal language. In reality, it changed everything. Imagine Congress wanted to raise $10 million through a direct tax. Today, lawmakers could simply create tax brackets and charge citizens based on what they earn. Back then, it didn't work that way. Instead, the government first had to calculate each state's share based solely on population. If one state contained 10% of the nation's people, that state would owe 10% of the entire tax bill. Whether its citizens were wealthy merchants or struggling farmers didn't matter. The numbers had to match the population, not the income. That created an almost impossible situation. A relatively poor state could end up paying a much heavier effective burden than a richer one, simply because its wealth and population didn't line up. The result wasn't just inconvenient, it was politically explosive. In practice, the rule made nationwide direct taxation so awkward, so controversial, and so difficult to administer that Congress had every incentive to avoid it altogether. And that wasn't an accident. Many of the Constitution's architects wanted exactly that outcome. If the federal government couldn't easily impose direct taxes, it would naturally remain smaller. Its spending would be limited by whatever revenue it could collect through less intrusive methods. It was, in many ways, an early constitutional break on the growth of centralized power. For decades, that safeguard worked exactly as intended. Washington rarely even considered taxing individual incomes because the constitutional barriers made the idea more trouble than it was worth. But a government still needed money. Soldiers still had to be paid. Ships still had to be built. The national debt still had to be reduced. So if America couldn't rely on taxing its own citizens directly, where would the money come from? One man believed he already had the answer. His name was Alexander Hamilton, and the financial system he built would keep the United States running for generations. If America's founders had closed the door on direct taxation, they had to open another one. Fortunately, one of the nation's sharpest financial minds already had a plan. Alexander Hamilton wasn't just the first Secretary of the Treasury. He was arguably the architect of America's entire financial system. While others focused on winning independence, Hamilton was already thinking about something just as important: how to make sure the new republic actually survived. To him, a nation's credit was every bit as important as its army. Without stable revenue, the United States wouldn't simply remain poor. It would lose the confidence of lenders, foreign governments, and investors. A country that couldn't pay its bills wouldn't be taken seriously on the world stage. Hamilton needed a source of income that was reliable, practical, and politically acceptable. His answer was surprisingly simple: tax the goods coming into the country, not the people living inside it. In 1789, one of the very first major laws signed by President George Washington was the Tariff Act of 1789, often associated with Hamilton because he was its strongest advocate. The idea couldn't have been more straightforward. Whenever foreign products entered an American port, British textiles, French wine, Caribbean sugar, Chinese tea, or countless other imports, the importer paid a customs duty before those goods entered the domestic market. Instead of sending tax collectors into every town across America, the federal government only needed officials stationed at a relatively small number of major ports: New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston. Control the harbors, and you controlled the flow of revenue. It was efficient. It was inexpensive to enforce. And perhaps most importantly, most ordinary Americans barely noticed it. The tax was built into the final price of imported goods rather than appearing as a direct bill from Washington. That distinction mattered enormously. People might resent paying higher prices, but psychologically, it felt very different from receiving a tax assessment from the federal government. Hamilton understood politics as well as economics. At exactly the right moment, tariffs also matched America's economic reality. The United States was still overwhelmingly agricultural. It produced enormous amounts of grain, tobacco, cotton, and other raw materials, but much of its manufactured equipment still came from Europe. That meant imports flowed steadily into American ports, and every shipment generated revenue. The results exceeded expectation. Throughout much of the period between 1790 and 1860, tariffs supplied roughly 90% of all federal revenue. In some years, that figure climbed even higher. Those customs duties financed almost everything the federal government actually did. They paid soldiers. They funded the Navy, they serviced the national debt, they kept the federal government operating without requiring officials to calculate every citizen's personal income. But Hamilton wasn't satisfied with simply balancing the budget. He saw another opportunity hidden inside the tariff system. If imported products became more expensive because of customs duties, Americans would naturally begin buying more goods produced at home. That would protect young domestic manufacturers from overwhelming European competition while giving American industry time to grow stronger. In modern terms, tariffs weren't just taxes. They were industrial policy, revenue and economic development working together. The strategy proved remarkably successful. Federal revenue climbed rapidly. Confidence returned. American government bonds became increasingly attractive to investors in Europe. Only a few years earlier, many people had questioned whether the United States would even survive. Now, international markets were beginning to trust the young republic. For Hamilton, it looked like the perfect financial machine. But every financial system has a weakness. Tariffs depended on trade, and trade could slow down. Wars disrupted shipping. Economic recessions reduced imports. Diplomatic conflicts could choke international commerce almost overnight. Hamilton knew relying on a single source of revenue was dangerous. If imports dried up, so would the government's income. So he began searching for a backup, another revenue stream, one that would continue flowing even when foreign trade faltered. His solution seemed modest, reasonable even. A small tax on a product millions of Americans already made every day. Instead, it would ignite one of the first constitutional crises in American history and test whether the new federal government could enforce its own laws at all. On paper, Alexander Hamilton's next proposal looked harmless. Compared to the tariffs filling federal coffers, it was small, limited, almost insignificant. He proposed an excise tax on domestically distilled spirits, especially whiskey. The idea seemed perfectly logical. If tariffs generated revenue from foreign trade, an excise tax could provide a steady stream of income from products made inside the country. Better yet, the proceeds could help reduce the enormous debt the young republic still carried after the Revolution. Congress agreed. President George Washington signed the measure into law in 1791. From Philadelphia, it appeared to be another sensible financial reform. Out on the American frontier, however, it looked like something entirely different. To understand why, you have to forget everything whiskey represents today. For thousands of settlers living west of the Appalachian Mountains, whiskey wasn't a luxury. It wasn't even primarily a drink. It was money. Farmers across western Pennsylvania produced huge amounts of corn, rye, and other grains. The problem wasn't growing crops, it was moving them. The roads crossing the mountains were rough, slow, and brutally expensive. Transporting wagon loads of grain hundreds of miles often cost more than the crops themselves were worth. So farmers found a smarter solution. They distilled their grain into whiskey. The liquid was lighter, it lasted longer, it spoiled less easily, and it carried far more value in a much smaller barrel. A harvest that was difficult to transport suddenly became practical to sell. In many frontier communities, whiskey became something even more important. It became currency. People settled debts with it. They traded it for tools. They paid workers with it. In some places, barrels of whiskey circulated almost like cash. Then Washington announced that every gallon would now be taxed. To officials in the capital, it was simply another revenue measure. To frontier farmers, it felt like a direct attack on their livelihoods. Many believed wealthy merchants along the East Coast could afford the tax with little difficulty, while small Western producers would bear the heaviest burden. Old resentments quickly resurfaced. Only a few years earlier, these same communities had fought a revolution against taxation imposed by a distant government. Now, another distant government was demanding payment once again. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Resistance spread almost immediately. Tax collectors weren't greeted with paperwork. They were greeted with threats. Some were beaten. Others were chased out of town. One federal officer, Robert Johnson, was stripped naked, covered in tar and feathers, and left tied to a tree as a warning to anyone else willing to enforce the law. Homes belonging to government supporters were vandalized. Anonymous letters signed by a mysterious figure known only as Tom the Tinker warned local residents that cooperating with federal officials could cost them everything. The conflict escalated month after month. By the summer of 1794, the dispute had transformed into something far more dangerous than tax resistance. Hundreds of armed men surrounded the home of federal tax inspector John Neville. Gunfire erupted. Lives were lost. Soon afterward, thousands of armed rebels gathered near Pittsburgh. Rumors spread that some wanted to separate from the United States altogether. Others whispered that foreign powers, including Britain and Spain, might recognize an independent Western republic. For President George Washington, this wasn't simply about collecting taxes anymore. It was about something much bigger. If the federal government backed down now, what message would that send? Could any law be enforced if enough people refused to obey it? Washington believed the survival of the Constitution itself was at stake. For the first and only time in American history, a sitting president personally took command of troops in the field. Nearly 13,000 militia from 4 states were assembled to crush the rebellion. But by the time that massive force reached western Pennsylvania, the resistance had already begun to collapse. Most rebels scattered. Only around 150 men were arrested. Just 2 were convicted of treason. And in a final act of restraint, Washington pardoned them both. The Whiskey Rebellion ended without becoming a full-scale civil war. Yet its political consequences lasted for decades. Many Americans walked away believing Hamilton's tax had gone too far. Others concluded that the federal government had proven it could enforce its laws even against armed resistance. The debate wasn't really about whiskey. It was about the limits of federal power. Thomas Jefferson had warned from the beginning that internal taxes would provoke exactly this kind of backlash. When he entered the White House in 1801, one of his first major decisions was to repeal virtually every internal federal tax, including the whiskey excise. America returned to the system its people trusted most. Tariffs once again became the government's primary source of income. It seemed as though the young republic had finally found a financial model everyone could live with. But hidden beyond the Appalachian Mountains lay another source of wealth, one even larger than tariffs, and one that would finance America's rise in a way no European nation could ever copy. For most nations, land is territory. For the young United States, it was something much more. It was a financial reserve unlike anything the world had ever seen. After winning independence, the federal government suddenly controlled vast stretches of wilderness stretching beyond the Appalachian Mountains. As the decades passed, that territory grew even larger through purchases, treaties, and conquest. The Louisiana Purchase, Florida, the Oregon Territory, the Mexican Cession. Each acquisition dramatically expanded the nation's borders. But these weren't simply new places on a map. They were assets. Millions upon millions of acres sat under federal ownership, waiting for settlers, speculators, and investors. Unlike European governments, which had long exhausted most of their available land, Washington possessed something almost impossible to measure in value. It owned the frontier itself. Instead of raising money by taxing incomes, the government could generate enormous revenue simply by selling pieces of the country it already controlled. To make that possible, Congress created a structured system for surveying and selling public land. The Land Ordinance of 1785 laid the foundation. Surveyors divided the frontier into orderly grids, making land easier to identify, value, and transfer. At first, purchasing federal land required buying large tracts 640 acres at $1 per acre. That wasn't affordable for many ordinary families. So over time, Congress adjusted the rules. The Harrison Land Act of 1800 reduced the minimum purchase and even allowed buyers to pay in installments. Later, the Land Act of 1820 lowered both the minimum acreage and the purchase price again, opening the door for many more settlers. These changes transformed federal land into one of the government's most dependable financial resources. On average, land sales generated revenue equal to roughly 14% of customs income. Some years produced far more. During the land boom of the 1830s, demand exploded. New territories became available as settlers pushed farther west, and millions of acres changed hands in an astonishingly short period. In 1836 alone, more than 20 million acres of public land were sold. The treasury overflowed with cash. For perhaps the only time in American history, the federal government found itself collecting more money than it actually needed. Then came one of the most remarkable financial milestones the country has ever achieved. In 1835, under President Andrew Jackson, the United States paid off virtually its entire national debt. After decades of borrowing, fighting wars, and struggling financially, the federal government owed almost nothing. The remaining balance was an astonishing $38,000. No other administration before or since has completely eliminated the national debt in the same way. For supporters of the existing system, it seemed like undeniable proof. Tariffs worked. Land sales worked. The Constitution's restrictions on direct taxation worked. America had managed to finance itself without asking citizens to surrender a percentage of every paycheck. It looked like the founders' vision had succeeded. But beneath that, success lay a far more complicated story. Much of the land being sold had not been empty. For thousands of years, Native American nations had lived across those territories. Many of the government's most profitable land sales only became possible after forced removals pushed entire communities from their ancestral homes. The wealth flowing into federal coffers carried a heavy moral cost. At the same time, fierce political battles erupted over what should happen to the remaining public lands. Should Washington continue selling them to generate revenue? Should families receive land almost free through future homesteading programs? Should railroad companies receive enormous grants to encourage Western development? Every proposal created new alliances and new enemies. Increasingly, those debates became intertwined with an even larger national conflict. As new territories entered the Union, Americans argued over whether slavery would expand with them. Questions that had once centered on finance slowly evolved into questions about the nation's future. By the late 1850s, the political compromise that had held the country together for generations was beginning to unravel. The government still relied on tariffs. Land continued generating revenue. On the surface, the financial system remained intact, but underneath, America was moving toward a crisis so enormous that every source of income the federal government depended on would suddenly become inadequate. Within a few years, the first shots would be fired at Fort Sumter. And the financial model that had sustained the United States for nearly 3/4 of a century would collapse almost overnight. For nearly 70 years, America's financial system had survived every challenge thrown at it. Tariffs generated the bulk of federal revenue. Public land brought in millions more. During emergencies, Congress occasionally imposed temporary excise taxes only to repeal them once the crisis had passed. It wasn't a perfect system, but it worked. Then came the Civil War, and suddenly nothing worked anymore. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, the United States wasn't simply entering another military conflict. It was entering the most expensive crisis in its history. Before the war, the federal government operated on a budget that now seems almost unimaginable. Washington spent roughly $172,000 a day to run the entire country. Just a few months into the conflict, those numbers became meaningless. The War Department alone was burning through nearly $1 million every single day. By the war's final years, the Treasury was spending roughly $80 million every month, an amount the pre-war government could scarcely have imagined. The old financial model collapsed under the weight of modern warfare. Tariffs, once the government's greatest strength, suddenly became unreliable. International trade slowed. Southern ports were blockaded. Shipping routes were disrupted. Imports declined. And as imports fell, so did customs revenue. At the very moment, Washington needed more money than ever before. Its largest source of income began disappearing. The government faced a choice unlike any it had encountered since independence: either find an entirely new way to raise money or risk losing the war. Congress chose the option America's founders had spent generations trying to avoid. For the first time in the nation's history, the federal government would tax individual income. The Revenue Act of 1861 signed by President Abraham Lincoln, introduced a 3% tax on annual incomes above $800. At the time, that affected only a small portion of the population. For most Americans, the tax changed nothing. But symbolically, it changed everything. The constitutional wall that had kept direct taxation at a distance had finally been breached. Ironically, however, the first income tax accomplished very little. The law had been drafted quickly during a national emergency. It lacked a practical system for assessment and collection. Without an effective enforcement mechanism, the government collected only a fraction of what lawmakers had expected. Congress immediately realized the problem. If the Union hoped to finance a prolonged war, it needed far more than a symbolic tax. It needed an entirely new financial system. So in 1862, lawmakers passed a much more comprehensive revenue law. This wasn't simply an updated tax bill. It was a complete reimagining of how the federal government could generate income. For the first time, America adopted a progressive income tax. Citizens earning between $600 and $10,000 paid one rate. Higher earners paid more. Later revisions pushed the highest rate to 10%, something that would have seemed almost unimaginable only a few years earlier. Yet, income taxes represented only one piece of an enormous fiscal transformation. Congress began taxing nearly everything it could identify: alcohol, tobacco, playing cards, gunpowder, leather, jewelry, newspaper advertisements, manufactured goods, professional licenses, corporate profits, even inheritances. The philosophy became almost comical in its simplicity. If something generated economic value, it could probably be taxed. Years later, economist David Wells, who helped oversee the Revenue Commission, described Congress's mindset with unforgettable humor. He compared lawmakers to someone walking through a crowded fair with one simple instruction: whenever you see a head, hit it. Congress had followed almost the same logic. Whenever it found a product, a profession, a business, or a source of income, it placed a tax on it. But perhaps the most important change wasn't the tax itself. It was the bureaucracy created to collect it. The Revenue Act of 1862 established the office of the Commissioner of Internal Revenue. At first, the agency consisted of only a handful of clerks. That didn't last long. Within months, thousands of assessors, collectors, and revenue officials were working across the country. For the first time, the federal government possessed an organized national apparatus dedicated to collecting taxes from its own citizens. That institution would eventually evolve into the Internal Revenue Service. The Civil War income tax did exactly what Congress hoped. Revenue increased dramatically as the conflict continued. But taxes alone still weren't enough. The Union financed much of the war by selling hundreds of millions of dollars in government bonds. It also introduced an entirely new form of paper currency, the greenback, allowing the government to pay soldiers and suppliers with Treasury-issued notes instead of gold or silver. Every available financial tool was thrown into the fight. Yet despite all these revolutionary measures, most Americans still believed one thing. When the war ended, so would the income tax. After all, it had been introduced as an emergency measure to preserve the Union, not as a permanent feature of American life. For a time, that prediction proved correct. In 1872, Congress repealed the wartime income tax. The country returned to the familiar world of tariffs and excise taxes. Many believed the experiment with taxing personal income had ended forever. They had no idea they were only witnessing the first chapter of a much longer story. Because over the next 2 decades, America itself would change in ways the Founding Fathers could never have imagined, and those changes would reopen the debate they thought had already been settled. When Congress repealed the Civil War income tax in 1872, most Americans assumed the debate was over. The tax had served its purpose. The Union had survived. The emergency had passed. So the country quietly returned to the financial model that had worked for generations. Once again, tariffs became the federal government's primary source of revenue. Excise taxes on products like alcohol and tobacco continued to bring in substantial income. Together, those two streams supplied almost everything Washington needed. For a while, it looked as though history had come full circle. The founders' original vision seemed alive once again. The federal government remained relatively small. Its responsibilities were limited. Most citizens went through their daily lives without ever dealing directly with a federal tax collector. If you had asked Americans during the 1870s whether the United States would ever adopt a permanent income tax, many would have laughed. Why would it? The old system was working, or at least it appeared to be. Because while Washington's finances had stabilized, the country itself was changing faster than anyone had anticipated. The America that emerged after the Civil War was no longer the rural republic Thomas Jefferson had imagined. Factories replaced workshops, railroads connected thousands of miles of territory. Steel mills rose where farmland had once stretched to the horizon. Entire industries grew almost overnight. The Industrial Revolution transformed not only how Americans worked, but also how wealth was created. And for the first time in the nation's history, enormous private fortunes began to appear. Names like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan became symbols of extraordinary success. These men built empires that reached into nearly every corner of the American economy. Their companies refined oil, produced steel, financed railroads, controlled banking, accumulated wealth on a scale few people had ever witnessed. To many Americans, they represented innovation and opportunity. To others, they represented something very different: concentrated economic power. As industrial fortunes expanded, so did the gap between rich and poor. Factory workers often labored long hours under dangerous conditions. Farmers struggled with unstable prices and mounting debt. Entire communities felt left behind while industrial centers accumulated unprecedented wealth. That growing inequality changed the way many people viewed the federal government's tax system. The tariff, once celebrated as an elegant solution, began attracting criticism from every direction. On paper, tariffs taxed imported goods. In practice, ordinary consumers paid those higher prices. Every imported tool, every piece of machinery, every manufactured product carried the added cost. A wealthy businessman and a struggling farmer might purchase the same imported plow. Both paid the same tariff, but the burden wasn't the same. For the wealthy buyer, it was barely noticeable. For the farmer, it represented a much larger share of his income. Critics increasingly described tariffs as regressive. The percentage paid might be identical. The sacrifice was not. At the same time, another accusation gained momentum. Many believed tariffs were no longer protecting the country. They were protecting corporations. Large manufacturers lobbied aggressively for even higher import duties, arguing that foreign competition threatened American industry. Their opponents saw something else. They believed politically connected businesses had learned how to use federal policy to shield themselves from competition while passing higher prices on to consumers. The government wasn't simply collecting revenue anymore. According to its critics, it was helping powerful industries become even more powerful. Those arguments reached a boiling point with the McKinley Tariff of 1,890. Average import duties climbed to nearly 50%, among the highest levels the nation had ever experienced. Supporters claimed the higher tariffs protected American jobs. Opponents argued they transferred wealth from millions of consumers into the hands of a relatively small number of industrialists. The political climate became increasingly polarized. People weren't merely debating taxes. They were debating fairness. Who should bear the cost of government? Should every consumer quietly pay higher prices whenever they bought imported goods? Or should those with the greatest incomes contribute a larger share directly? That single question began reshaping American politics. For decades, income taxes had been viewed as unconstitutional, impractical, or unnecessary. Now they were being discussed in an entirely different light. Not simply as a source of revenue, but as a tool for addressing inequality itself. The idea that had disappeared after the Civil War was slowly returning. This time, however, it wasn't driven by military necessity. It was driven by economic, by politics, and by growing public frustration with the nation's changing balance of wealth. Soon, Congress would make its first serious attempt to bring the income tax back during peacetime. And what happened next would send the battle out of the halls of Congress and into the Supreme Court of the United States. By the early 1890s, the United States found itself facing a very different kind of crisis. It wasn't a civil war. It wasn't a rebellion. This time, the battlefield was the economy. In 1893, one of the worst financial depressions in American history swept across the country. Banks failed at an alarming pace. More than 600 financial institutions closed their doors. Businesses collapsed. Railroads went bankrupt. Factories shut down, leaving thousands without work. Public frustration spread quickly. Many Americans believed the existing tax system simply wasn't equipped for a modern industrial nation. Tariffs continued generating revenue, but they also continued driving up the cost of imported goods. To growing numbers of farmers, laborers, and reformers, the burden no longer seemed fair. If industrial fortunes were reaching unprecedented heights, why should ordinary consumers continue carrying so much of the financial load? A new proposal gained momentum. Instead of relying almost entirely on taxes hidden inside the prices of goods, why not tax income directly, especially the incomes of the wealthiest Americans? The idea wasn't revolutionary anymore. The Civil War had already demonstrated that an income tax could be collected. The question was no longer whether it could work. The question was whether it could survive the Constitution. In 1894, Congress passed the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act. Buried inside the legislation was something America had never attempted during peacetime: a 2% federal income tax on annual incomes above $4,000. At the time, that threshold placed the tax squarely on the nation's highest earners. Very few Americans would owe anything at all. Supporters argued the proposal would make the tax system more balanced. Critics saw something far more dangerous. Many believed Congress was trying to do indirectly what the Constitution explicitly discouraged. The political calculations became surprisingly cynical. Some lawmakers voted for the bill even though they doubted it would ever take effect. Why? Because they expected the Supreme Court to strike it down. That way they could tell voters, "We tried," without actually living under the new law. It was a political gamble, and it worked almost exactly as expected. In 1895, the case of Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company reached the Supreme Court. The nation watched closely. The decision would determine far more than one tax law. It would determine how much financial authority Congress truly possessed. After intense debate, the court ruled 5-4 against the income tax. The majority concluded that taxes on income derived from property including rents, interest, and dividends qualified as direct taxes. And under the Constitution, direct taxes still had to be apportioned among the states according to population. The Wilson-Gorman Act hadn't done that. As a result, the income tax provision was declared unconstitutional. Legally, the ruling settled the case. Politically, it ignited a firestorm. To supporters of the decision, the court had faithfully defended the Constitution. To opponents, it looked like something entirely different. They believed the judiciary had erected a protective shield around America's wealthiest citizens. Justice Henry Brown, one of the dissenting justices, warned that the ruling effectively surrendered the nation's taxing power to the moneyed class. Outside the courtroom, anger spread quickly. Farmers, factory workers, progressive reformers, populist politicians. Many saw the decision as proof that powerful financial interests held enormous influence over American institutions. The debate was no longer just about government revenue. It had become a debate about fairness, about political power, about who actually benefited from the existing system. The Democratic Party quickly embraced the income tax as one of its central political causes. Across the country, reform movements grew stronger. Yet everyone understood one uncomfortable reality. The Supreme Court had spoken. Passing another ordinary law wouldn't solve the problem. As long as the Constitution remained unchanged, any permanent income tax faced the same obstacle. There was only one path left: change the Constitution itself. That sounded almost impossible. Constitutional amendments required overwhelming support in Congress and approval from 3/4 of the states. Few believed such a sweeping change could ever succeed. But history has a way of moving in unexpected directions. Within little more than a decade, an unlikely political figure would propose exactly that. And with a single constitutional amendment, the financial blueprint the Founding Fathers had designed more than a century earlier would be rewritten forever. For nearly 15 years after the Pollock decision, the income tax debate refused to die. It never disappeared from political speeches. It never disappeared from newspaper headlines. And it certainly never disappeared from the minds of millions of Americans who believed the country's tax system no longer reflected the nation it had become. The United States was changing at breathtaking speed. Factories continued expanding. Cities grew larger every year. Corporate empires stretched across multiple states. The federal government faced challenges that simply hadn't existed when the Constitution was written in 1787. Many reformers reached the same conclusion. The problem wasn't the income tax itself. The problem was the Constitution. As long as direct taxes remained bound by the old apportionment requirement, every future income tax faced the same legal obstacle. If the country wanted a permanent solution, the Constitution itself would have to change. That sounded almost impossible. Constitutional amendments were intentionally difficult. First, 2/3 of both houses of Congress had to approve the proposal. Then, 3/4 of the states had to ratify it. The process was designed to prevent sudden political swings from rewriting the nation's founding document. For years, many assumed an income tax amendment would never clear those hurdles. Ironically, the breakthrough came from someone few expected. President William Howard Taft was no radical reformer. He wasn't leading mass protests. He wasn't campaigning against America's wealthiest industrialists. In fact, he was a conservative Republican who generally favored stability over sweeping political change. Yet Taft recognized something many others did not. As long as the constitutional question remained unresolved, the nation would continue fighting the same battle over and over again. In 1909, he proposed what became the 16th Amendment. Its language was remarkably concise. Congress would have the power to levy taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the states and without regard to population. Those few words accomplished something extraordinary. They didn't create the income tax. They removed the constitutional barrier that had prevented Congress from making one permanent. In many ways, it was less a new idea than the removal of an old restriction. The proposal immediately ignited another nationwide debate. Supporters argued that the amendment simply modernized a government struggling to keep pace with a rapidly changing economy. Opponents warned of something far more dangerous. If Washington gained unrestricted authority to tax personal income, what limits would remain on federal power? Many wealthy business leaders feared exactly that. They argued an income tax would punish success, discourage investment, expand bureaucracy, and gradually centralize authority in Washington at the expense of states and individual citizens. Across the country, newspapers, politicians, business organizations, and reform groups battled fiercely over the amendment. For nearly 4 years, the outcome remained uncertain. Then the political landscape shifted. The progressive movement gained momentum. Public frustration with concentrated corporate power continued growing. Calls for reform became increasingly difficult to ignore. The election of Woodrow Wilson in 1912 reflected that changing mood. Americans were demanding a government that looked very different from the one their grandparents had known. Finally, on the 3rd of February 1913, history changed. The required 36 states ratified the amendment. For the first time since the nation's founding, Congress possessed clear constitutional authority to impose a permanent federal income tax without following the old apportionment rules. The legal debate that had stretched across generations was over. Lawmakers wasted no time putting their new authority to work. Later that same year, Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1913. The new tax was surprisingly modest. Most Americans didn't owe a single dollar. Only incomes above $3,000 faced taxation, beginning at 1%, while the highest earners paid graduated surtaxes reaching 7%. By modern standards, those rates seem remarkably low. Only about 3% of American households actually paid the new tax. At first glance, the change appeared almost symbolic. Federal revenue from tariffs still exceeded revenue from income taxes. Daily life for the average citizen barely changed. Many people assumed the new system would simply become another small piece of the federal budget. But appearances can be deceptive. The significance of 1913 wasn't measured by the amount of money collected. It was measured by the framework that had just been created. For the first time, the federal government possessed both the constitutional authority and the institutional machinery to tax personal income indefinitely. Even more important, it didn't have to build that machinery from scratch. The administrative foundation already existed. The Wartime Bureau of Internal Revenue, originally created during the Civil War, had continued operating for decades by collecting excise taxes on products like alcohol and tobacco. Now, that same organization simply received a new mission. The infrastructure was waiting, the legal authority was finally in place. Everything the federal government needed already existed. What happened next would prove that 1913 wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning, because within a single year, events unfolding thousands of miles away in Europe would send the United States into a new era, one in which the income tax would expand beyond anything its earliest supporters or critics had imagined. When Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1913, very few Americans imagined it would reshape the country. Why would they? The new tax barely affected ordinary families. Only a small percentage of households earned enough to owe anything at all. Most people continued living exactly as they had before. The federal government still relied heavily on tariffs. Income taxes were simply another source of revenue, or so it seemed. History, however, had other plans. Barely a year after the 16th Amendment was ratified, Europe erupted into the First World War. At first, the United States remained on the sidelines. But as the conflict expanded, the financial demands placed on governments grew beyond anything the 19th century had ever experienced. Modern warfare wasn't cheap. It required massive armies, factories operating around the clock, ships, railroads, weapons, food, medical supplies. Every month of war consumed staggering amounts of money. When America entered the conflict in 1917, Washington suddenly needed revenue on a scale unimaginable only a few years earlier. The income tax that had been introduced so cautiously in 1913 suddenly became the government's most powerful financial tool. Rates climbed rapidly. The highest tax bracket rose from 7% to 15%, then to 67%, and eventually reached 77% during the war. The increase shocked many Americans. Only 4 years earlier, the income tax had been presented as a modest reform aimed primarily at the wealthy. Now it had become one of the government's primary methods of financing a global conflict. When the war ended, tax rates declined. But something important had changed. They never returned to where they had started. The temporary emergency had left behind a permanent institution. The income tax had taken root. Over the following decades, the federal government gradually expanded its responsibilities. Économique crise, infrastructure, veterans programs, financial regulation. Each new responsibility required resources. Each new responsibility strengthened the argument for stable, predictable revenue. Then came another event that accelerated the transformation even further. The Great Depression. Millions lost their jobs. Banks collapsed. Businesses disappeared almost overnight. The federal government responded on a scale previous generations would scarcely have recognized. Programs that once seemed impossible became national policy. In 1935, Social Security was established, creating a long-term commitment to retirement benefits that required continuous funding. 3 decades later, Medicare and Medicaid dramatically expanded the federal government's role in healthcare, education, housing, transportation, environmental regulation, scientific research, energy. Federal responsibilities multiplied throughout the 20th century. Every expansion required one simple thing: money. And unlike tariffs, income taxes could grow alongside the economy itself. As incomes increased, revenue increased. As the population expanded, revenue expanded. The ceiling that had once limited federal finances during the tariff era had effectively disappeared. But perhaps the single most important transformation arrived during the Second World War. Not because tax rates changed, because the method of collecting taxes changed. Before 1943, many Americans paid their taxes after receiving their income. They earned their wages first. Then, they calculated what they owed. Then they sent payment to the government. It was visible. It was immediate. People could feel exactly how much money was leaving their pockets. That year, Washington introduced a system that would permanently alter the relationship between workers and taxation. Payroll withholding. Instead of waiting until the end of the year, employers began deducting taxes directly from employees' paychecks before workers ever received their wages. The difference was profound. Citizens no longer experienced taxation as one large annual payment. Instead, taxes quietly disappeared before the paycheck even reached their hands. The process became automatic, routine. almost invisible. From the government's perspective, withholding solved multiple problems at once. Revenue arrived continuously. Tax compliance improved dramatically. Administrative costs fell. From the workers' perspective, however, something subtle had changed. People no longer paid taxes with money they possessed. They simply received less money from the beginning. It was one of the most influential administrative innovations in American fiscal history. Not because tax rates changed, but because the psychology of taxation changed. Over time, the income tax ceased to feel like an extraordinary government demand. It became part of everyday life. Generations grew up assuming this was how governments had always operated. Yet history tells a very different story. For more than a century, the United States had functioned under an entirely different philosophy. A philosophy in which the federal government remained relatively small because its sources of revenue were naturally limited. Once direct taxation of income became permanent, those limits largely disappeared. And with greater financial capacity came greater governmental ambition. Today, the federal government collects roughly $4.4 trillion in annual revenue. Individual income taxes contribute around $2.5 trillion. Payroll taxes supporting programs like Social Security and Medicare add roughly $1.7 trillion more. Together, those two categories account for well over 90% of federal revenue. Meanwhile, tariffs, the financial engine that once funded nearly the entire government, now contribute only a tiny fraction of the federal budget. The system built by Hamilton had not completely disappeared, but it had become almost unrecognizable. The United States had entered an entirely new era. The question was no longer whether the government could collect enough revenue. The question had become something much larger. What had America gained, and what had it quietly left behind when it abandoned the financial philosophy of its founders? Looking back, it's tempting to see this story as nothing more than a history of taxes. But it was never really about taxes. It was about power. For the first 124 years of the American Republic, the federal government operated under a very different philosophy. Its revenue came primarily from commerce, tariffs, excise taxes, public land. Those sources placed natural limits on what Washington could collect, and those limits, in turn, placed limits on what Washington could do. Whether those limits were good or bad is still debated today. Supporters argue they preserved individual liberty and kept government from growing beyond its original purpose. Critics point out that the same system left millions of Americans without even the most basic protections. There was no Social Security for aging workers, no Medicare for the elderly, no federal safety net during economic collapse. Unsafe factories often operated with little oversight. Child labor remained common in many industries. Entire communities could fall into poverty with almost no help from the federal government. The old system created freedom, but it also created vulnerability. Then came the income tax. At first, it seemed like a small adjustment. A modest levy aimed primarily at the wealthiest citizens. Few people imagined that within a few decades, it would become the financial foundation of the modern American state. Yet that's exactly what happened. Once the government gained the constitutional authority to tax income directly, the rules changed. Revenue was no longer tied primarily to ships entering American harbors or land being sold on the frontier. It became tied to the productivity of the nation's people. As the economy expanded, government revenue expanded. As incomes increased, federal resources increased. For supporters, this transformation made possible programs that fundamentally changed American life: retirement security, national infrastructure, scientific research, public health, disaster relief, education, veterans benefits, countless responsibilities that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. For critics, however, the same transformation carried another consequence. A government no longer constrained by limited revenue could continue expanding its reach into areas that had once belonged almost entirely to states, communities, or individuals. In other words, the debate never really ended. It simply evolved. That debate is still alive today. Every discussion about tax rates, government spending, budget deficits, tariffs, corporate taxation, or social programs ultimately circles back to the same question Americans have been asking since the nation's founding: how much government is enough? Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson answered that question differently. The politicians of the Gilded Age answered it differently. The reformers who fought for the 16th Amendment answered it differently. Modern Americans continue answering it differently. And perhaps that's exactly why this story remains so relevant. Because history rarely gives us permanent solutions. It gives us trade-offs. The founders built a financial system designed to prevent concentrated federal power. Over time, economic growth, industrialization, political reform, and 2 world wars gradually replaced that system with another. Neither existed in a vacuum. Both reflected the challenges of their own time. Understanding how that transformation happened doesn't automatically tell us which system was better, but it does give us something even more valuable. Perspective, because once you understand where today's tax system came from, you begin to realize that it was never inevitable. It was the product of more than a century of conflict, compromise, crisis, and political choice. And that means future generations may choose differently once again. If there's one lesson to take away from this story, it's that governments aren't shaped only by elections or wars. They're shaped by the way they're funded. Every major shift in American history, from the founding of the Republic to the Civil War, from the Progressive Era to the modern federal government, was also a story about who paid, how they paid, and what that allowed the government to become. Whether you believe the old system was better, the modern system is fairer, or the truth lies somewhere in between, one thing is certain. History becomes far more interesting when you look beneath the surface. If this video gave you a new perspective on America's past, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think the United States could ever function again without a permanent federal income tax, or has that chapter of history closed forever? Share your opinion in the comments below. If you enjoyed exploring the hidden forces that shaped modern America, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the moments, decisions, and forgotten stories that continue to influence our world today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.